Hi, I'm here today with Kevin Tumlinson, and I'm going to go ahead and start off. Hi, Kevin. How you doing?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Pretty good. So let me tell everybody a little bit about who you are. Kevin Tumlinson is an award-winning and best-selling novelist living in Texas and working in random coffee shops, cafes, and hotel lobbies worldwide. His debut thriller, The Coelho Medallion, was a 2016 Shelf-Notable Indie Award winner. Kevin grew up in Wild Peach, Texas, where he was raised by his grandparents and given a healthy respect for storytelling. He often found himself in trouble in school for writing stories instead of doing his actual assignments. And he doesn't regret that in the least. Kevin's love for history, archaeology, and science has been a tremendous source of material for his writing, feeding his fiction and giving him just the excuse he needs to read the next article, biography, or research paper. Well, Kevin, my first question is, as the author of the Coelho Medallion, a Dan Kotler archaeological thriller, so my first question is, why do you write books with titles that are so hard to pronounce?
Because it makes them sound mysterious, man. It makes them
Right?
stand out. Anybody can write, something Atlantis or, something, Egyptians or whatever, but, or Templars this or whatever, but
Sure.
who else? What other author? Name one who's written anything titled Coelho.
Coelho, is that how you say it?
It's pretty, yeah. I learned that from the guy who produced the audiobook for it, actually. He went out and found it because it's a Portuguese name. It's named for Paulo Coelho, who is the author of a book called The Alchemist, which was a very influential book for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that name, I always pronounced it Coelho also. But he didn't correct me. He was checking in with me. So I pronounced this Coelho, like the Portuguese name, right? Absolutely. That is absolutely what I intended when I wrote that.
Right. Nice. So tell us a little bit about you and what you write.
I write archaeological thrillers, which is relatively new in my career. I started my writing career way, way, way back, writing pretty much anything that came into my head. Any type of story. I wasn't nailed down to a particular genre when I was younger. But I started writing science fiction and publishing science fiction back in 2008. And I wrote a handful of books in that genre and in the sort of YA fantasy genre. And those books did okay. They did pretty well, but it wasn't until later I was on a podcast, another guest of yours, a good friend of mine, Nick Thacker. We used to have a show together called the Self-Publishing Answers podcast. And we were on air one day, and he dared me to write a thriller like he writes. And I thought, if Nick can do it, how hard can it be? But I did work on that, and that first one was really kind of meant to be a sort of an in-joke. It had a lot of in-jokes between me and Nick. I didn't expect it to do fantastic or anything, but it did. It did incredibly well. It won some awards. It hit bestseller status on a couple of different platforms. It just took off. It's still to this day my number one bestseller. And it still earns me a pretty good paycheck every month. So and that despite it having some flaws.
Your thriller career is based on the idea of showing up a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And
I built a career on a dare, and it turned out to be the best decision I ever made for my author career, actually.
And I've read the Coelho Medallion, and I know it features a certain character who's named after a mutual friend of ours.
Yes, it features. So it actually, you could say that about several characters, I think, at this point. But yes, one of the characters is named Roland Denzel.
Mm-hmm.
Before I ever actually knew him all that well, I think I heard him on a podcast, probably the self-publishing podcast, and I thought, for some reason I've always loved the name Roland.
It's a great name.
If you look at my books, I have at least 3 books with variations on the name Roland, and I knew I was going to name that agent Roland, and when I heard, for some reason, the name Roland Denzel had stuck in my head, so I actually named the character before realizing who I was naming it for. But now that he and I have met and hung out, we've been to Vegas together, we've had drinks together, we're doing some stuff together, I can go ahead and just admit that it's named for Roland Denzel, the author, the the fitness expert.
Nice.
A really good guy. He's been on my show. He's a real good guy. So I couldn't think of anyone more worthy. He is in no way anything at all like Agent Roland Denzel, as far as I know. I mean, they don't share very many personality characteristics, but they're both good men. So
Nice.
I don't think the real world Roland Denzel would take a bullet for me, though.
No?
He might.
I guess you
He
won't
might.
know until it comes up.
Until we put him in that scenario.
So today we're actually here not to talk about Roland Denzel, although he's a great guy. We're going to talk about Angels and Demons by Dan Brown, and that you've indicated is your favorite thriller. So could you give us a spoiler-free teaser or synopsis, or just give us a little bit about what the book is about?
I can, and I will. First, I'm going to start by confessing it may not be my most favorite thriller. It's just up there in my list for a few reasons. It is the story of this is the very first appearance of Robert Langdon, Dr. Robert Langdon, who is the principal protagonist in a lot of Dan Brown's thrillers. He is this professor who teaches art history, who has an eidetic memory, and who has a proclivity for finding himself in the middle of all sorts of international intrigue, mostly in and around, major European metropolitan areas like Rome and Barcelona and areas like that. But so the book, it features the first appearance of Robert Langdon, and the discovery that a couple of scientists who are associated with CERN have actually invented or managed to make a sizable quantity of antimatter, and that antimatter is subsequently stolen by a party to be named. But the implications are that it is all part of an Illuminati plot. And if you've been reading or watching television or films or just chatting with anybody who has a pulse over the last couple of decades, the Illuminati has become more and more a part of pop culture. So the Illuminati were not that well known when this book made its first appearance. And so it was a very shocking idea to the public that there could be this organization out there pulling the strings behind the scenes, or having a grudge against the Catholic Church. But the Illuminati have apparently stolen this antimatter. They've essentially made it into a bomb that could wipe out the Vatican, and they have snuck it into the Vatican somehow, some way, and in the process managed to kidnap 4 of the principal cardinals who would stand a chance of taking the place of the Pope, who has recently passed. So our hero and his, we'll call her a sidekick, although she actually in many ways outpaces the protagonist of this book, Vittoria. She is one of the scientists who created the antimatter. Her father was murdered in the process of this stuff getting stolen, and the two of them, Vittoria and Robert Langdon, are on a race against the clock to find the antimatter, to save the bishops or clerics or whatever they are, the high priests, and save the day. So that, in a nutshell, is Angels and Demons. But this book, by the way, has a special place in my heart, because when this book came out, about less than a year, probably about maybe 6 to 9 months before this book came out, I was working at a radio show called Tom King's CompuTalk, and we interviewed Dan Brown, who was not yet all that famous. He had actually written a book about technology, about cybercrime, basically. And we had him on the show because that was a topic that we covered. But as a thank you for us, we actually helped him build his computer, a brand new computer from spare parts. We gave him some parts. We talked him through how to install things. I personally was on the phone with him to talk him through a few things. And as a thank you for our help with that, he actually mentions us in the acknowledgments in the front of Angels and Demons. So that's one of the reasons why I went ahead and chose this book to talk about. But for anybody who has heard of the movie or the book, the Da Vinci Code, this is the book that happened before it. So
Yeah, I've read Angels and Demons, and like most people, I read the Da Vinci Code first, because Da Vinci Code was one of those books like Harry Potter or The Hunger Games that even
yeah,
people who don't read have read that one.
right.
Um,
It just introduced you to the world of this type of thriller.
yeah.
Yeah, a lot of careers came out of this. By the way, when Dan Brown first released Angels and Demons, it began a buzz. And then when Da Vinci Code hit and really hit hard, especially with the film, it created a demand for this genre of thriller.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you got guys like Steve Barry and James Rollins and these thriller writers who may or may not have had a career without Dan Brown, but because of Dan Brown, they got on a fast track for a thriller career. And he created a genre that I love, that I write in. So somebody to be grateful for.
What do you think it is about the character of Robert Langdon that's so intriguing that people are willing to follow him across multiple books?
I think it's two things. There is, in some respect, an aspect of superhumanity to the guy in that he has a photographic memory, for one, but also that he has such a wide knowledge of history and art history in particular, but symbology, this sort of secret language. So that's intriguing to people, right? It's like learning. It's like being let in on a secret code. But as superhuman as he can sometimes be, the thing that makes Robert Langdon sort of endearing is how human he is, how he fumbles, he makes mistakes. In the first portion of the book, the first like third of the book, he makes a major mistake that basically throws off their timing on saving a life. So his quote sidekick for the book is the one who figures it out and solves it for him. So even though they wouldn't even know about what a path to take, basically they wouldn't have any clues without Robert Langdon. He wasn't the one that solved the first problem. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the sort of thing that makes these stories endearing, because we can kind of, even though most of us don't have eidetic memories, God, I wish I did. We do identify with, occasionally being wrong. Sometimes I'm sometimes wrong, but we can identify with a character like that.
Yeah, I seem to remember, speaking of the sidekick, that in most of the Robert Langdon books, I think I've read all except for the last one, Origin, he has a female sidekick where there's some tame sexual tension between them, and usually the female sidekick is smarter and more capable than he is. From what I remember, if I remember right,
he's a bit of a doofus. Yeah, and the thing is, and Dan Brown has actually talked about this at length, really, but there's a lament to Robert Langdon that he's always paired with these capable, brilliant, beautiful women who are completely out of his league and completely unattainable. And there is sexual tension. There is a little bit of romantic tension, but nothing ever really comes of it because they're too busy surviving, for one thing. But even beyond that, there's a sort of respect, and Langdon suffers from the same sin. This is another reason I think he may be relatable, especially to guys, but that sort of syndrome of, the guy and the really cute girl get along great, giggle together, have fun together. She starts to think of him as a brother. And I think that's what happens. You think of Robert Langdon as the sort of doofus brother, really smart, somebody you really love and care about, but you couldn't date him. Not until later when you're settling down.
Can you tell us about the villain without spoiling anything? I don't remember if it's been too long since I've read it.
I'm gonna say that I don't want this is gonna be a tricky one, because I definitely do not want to spoil this for someone who hasn't read it or seen the film. Let's just say that Dan Brown has a tendency to present a villain who is certainly a villain, but who may not be the only villain. There is usually someone else behind the scenes, maybe pulling the strings or influencing things. And it's not always who you think it's going to be. So he likes these multi-tiered antagonists. He likes to present antagonists that have layers, not just personality layers, but sort of layers of influence. So let's just say that there is someone with a vested interest in influencing the choice of the new pope, and they have engaged the services of others who are very capable and very deadly, who also have their own designs and their own agendas. So it's not a clear-cut answer on the villain without giving things away, but that's part of the charm of books like this. You want to read this because you love the heroes, and unlike sort of the old cliche mustache twirling villains of old, it's almost unclear who the villain is by the time things are over. The best stories, by the way, and Dan Brown I think recognizes this and does this skillfully, I think, but the best stories are not so much that there is someone who is purely evil that you must stop, but someone who actually might be right in some way, who might actually have a point in some way. They've just chosen the most horribly wrong way to go about meeting their own agenda. So that's the type of story this is.
And don't you find that pretty often in thrillers, that for a really good thriller, the villain has to be equally as compelling as the hero?
Yeah, absolutely. If you can't find yourself somehow identifying with the villain, then you're probably not well connected to the story. And I say that knowing that I fail at that in my own books pretty often. But you should have some sort of empathy for the villain, if not sympathy. You should be able to understand their point of view, why they're motivated to do what they do, and not that you would take the same actions that they would take, but you could understand how you might get there. Mm-hmm. And that's the sign of a good story altogether. It doesn't matter if it's thriller, it doesn't matter if it's romance, whatever the story is. The antagonist of that story, the force against which the protagonist throws themselves, has to be something discernible and understandable and empathetic. Mm-hmm. And that's good.
Did you see the Black Panther?
I did, yes.
I think that, speaking of villains, I think that was probably the best Marvel villain ever, because as I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't seen it, but when the villain revealed his plan and his motivation, I was like, I see where he's coming from. I kind of think he's right.
Yeah, I only have a slight problem with the sort of Kilgore was right ideology, and that is that what he was proposing, his solution, is a familiar solution if you've studied history, and we also know that it doesn't work. Yeah. However, looking at that, you became completely sympathetic as well as empathetic to what he was up against. You get the sense, that what he's doing is wrong.
Yeah.
But you also understand that he's doing the wrong things for essentially the right reasons. And especially in today's climate, there's a lot of division in the world right now. It's a little sad to see, but I think we need more of that ability to pay attention to both sides and try to understand both sides. We need to be able to see the bad guy as not just purely, a bad guy.
Yeah.
We can have the story where we're fighting the mindless automatons bent on conquering and overcoming all life or whatever. We can have those stories, but they aren't as compelling. There's a reason I couldn't think of an example of one, right? Maybe like the Borg in Star Trek or something. They're not as compelling a villain as say Kilgore in Black Panther, or even Ultron in the Avengers film. Mm-hmm. He was actually, you could kind of understand where he was coming from too.
Yeah.
Even though he was a complete sociopath. So
Yeah, I do want to pull this back to Angels and Demons, but
yeah,
I'll just say this about the Borg. I remember maybe they're not compelling, but they were terrifying enough
yeah, yeah,
because they were so powerful and
yeah,
so
and unrelatable.
mysterious. Yeah.
Yeah.
They were terrifying enough that I still kept me glued to my chair to make sure that Jean-Luc Picard was going to make it through okay.
But it was kind of a one-off, right? Because when you started seeing them every week, they weren't as compelling. When
Yeah,
you saw Jean-Luc Picard become Locutus, your blood ran cold for 3 months while you waited for the show to come back.
yeah, and then when they pull the curtain back and you see more and more about the Borg, yeah, you're right. They're not as terrifying. Anyway, okay, we can.
All right, we could. That's a whole other show.
Well, let me pull this back to Angels and Demons. So,
Yes.
aside from the fact that you're mentioned in the acknowledgments, what do you think makes it stand above other thrillers that you'd want to mention it as your favorite or one of your favorite thrillers?
I think because it's an origin story of sorts, because there are further books in the series, we'll say, and we get to see Robert Langdon evolve over like 4 more books. This is the origin story. This is where we saw the birth of the hero. So there's part of it is about that. The history involved is real history. The science involved is real science. He's made a few mistakes here and there. One notable mistake, he kept referring. So I get what he's talking about because I write about this exact same concept in my own books. The idea of comparative mythology and how, for example, Christianity has, at various times in history, has taken over the traditions of other cultures and faiths and just basically swapped out the God, right? So that's a real thing. We know that's a real thing. Regardless of where you stand, I'm a Christian, but I get that Christians have done this. But he at one point said, well, baptism was something the Mayans practiced, that sort of thing. He's talking about all the things that Christianity, ancient European Christianity took from Central American mythology, which they did not encounter until like 1,000 years after the founding of Christianity. So he's kind of mixed a few things up, but despite that, it shows real thought. It shows he's put this together. He's done his research. So you get to participate in that and feel like you're a part of it, and that's one of the things that really compelled me, and it drives my books now. I do the same sort of thing, the same sort of research he does now with my own work.
What do you think, here's a more general question, what do you think makes a thriller a thriller? What separates it from another genre like mystery?
So there are elements of mystery. There are elements of practically every genre in a thriller, depending on the type of thriller. I think what makes a thriller is that you've got a contemporary setting, as contemporary as it has to be, within the span of 50 years from today forward or backward. I think it's probably about right. No real like sci-fi future settings, but you've got a contemporary setting with a contemporary hero who is human. Just even if they have some advantages, maybe they're a ex-special forces, maybe they are a ninja, an archaeologist, whatever. Maybe they have a eidetic memory. They might have some advantages, but on the whole, they are a standard issue human being. They weren't born with great power. They can't fly. They can't do anything like that. And you pit them against extraordinary circumstances, and they fail, and then get back up and solve the problem. And they generally, thrillers revolve, even though they can involve quite a bit of action, they almost invariably revolve around the intelligence of the protagonist. Somehow that protagonist is going to have to think his or her way out of trouble, and be very clever about it. Those are the sort of elements that I think are fairly unique to thrillers. If you have a mystery, typically the person solving the mystery, they may find themselves in danger, but any cleverness is directed towards solving the crime. The thriller and the thriller protagonist has to solve the mystery, but also has to survive. And typically, they have to figure out how to survive by their wits. So, I think that's a fairly unique aspect of thrillers.
So just FYI, my next series is going to be called X Special Forces Ninja Archaeologist.
I think you have a winner.
The audience is built in. It will apply to everyone.
It goes everywhere. It does all things. I'm in. I have already read this book.
So, Kevin, what book of yours would you like to talk about today?
I think my latest is probably a fun one to talk about. It's called The God Extinction. It is. I just released it like less than a month ago, and like Angels and Demons and Da Vinci Code, it revolves around my protagonist, who is he's not a professor, but he is a doctor of archaeology. He's an archaeologist who is also he's a multi-hyphenate, by the way. He's an archaeologist who is also he has a background in quantum physics, so he is a very intelligent man. He does not have a photographic memory as much as I would want one myself, but he does have a vast knowledge of both history and science, and puts those to work quite often. And in The God Extinction, it asks the question, what if the gods of mythology had been real? What if they were real, but were just no longer among us? What it really does is build on a lot of research I've done into what's called comparative mythology, which I mentioned earlier, which is the idea that we have a lot of mythology and symbolism and sort of cultural ideas that are essentially the same between various cultures. So, for example, the best example is the flood myth. Every major religion, including the Central American religions or cultures, every major culture has a mythology that revolves around a flood myth. Every one of them, and whether they're disparate from each other or not, they also tend to have these godlike figures who share characteristics. There is, coming back to Central America, there is a figure called Viracocha, who was a bearded white god among a people who'd never seen facial hair, by the way, who walked among the Central American peoples, the Americans, the early Americans, ancient Americans, performing miracles, healing. He had his group of 12 people who walked with him. If this story sounds a little familiar, raise your hand. I mean, there's a lot of that sort of stuff throughout our cultural history across the world. So The God Extinction looks at the idea. It's a follow-up to a short story that was actually the very first Dan Kotler story called The Brass Hall that I wrote as a prequel before I released Quello Medallion. I just wanted to have two books in that series when I released Quello Medallion to give people somewhere to go, right? Mm-hmm. While I wrote the next book. And so, but the one complaint I always had from readers about The Brass Hall was that they wished it was a full-length novel. So what I decided to do was, rather than extend it, and rewrite it as a full-length novel, I wrote a sequel to it, and I set it essentially in the same place with the same ideas 20 years later. And so the events in Brass Hall take place 20 years before God Extinction, and what we've found is the tomb of a Celtic god that ends up turning up in Egypt, where it should not be. And so this sets Kotler and Agent Denzel tags along on this one, even though this one's not an official FBI case. But Kotler is now finding himself embroiled in this mystery about why this tomb is here. How did it get there, and what's the connection? How is everything connected? And over the course of the story, we reveal more connections to other cultures and that sort of thing. But that's what it is. It's an exploration of this idea of what if the gods were real? What would that mean for us historically? So that's I think it's a great book. I mean, it's getting a lot of great reviews. People seem to be digging it, and that's the one I recommend.
Nice. So that was The God Extinction, which you can pick up on Amazon, and it does have some nice reviews. It's at 4.9 out of 5 stars. Wow. Congratulations. Yeah. That's impressive. All right. That was The God Extinction, and my guest today was Kevin Tumlinson, and I want to thank you so much for hanging out with me and talking about your favorite thriller.
You got it, man. I appreciate you having me on. Thanks a lot.
Take care.